Hey, a big welcome to everybody joining us today on YouTube Live to the Lust is Boring podcast. We got a great show lined up for you today. We have Father Malachy Napier, who is part of the Capuchin Friars, the Renewal. He's going to be joining us from New York today to talk about gender and why matters. Before we jump into everything today, first I want to give a big thank you to all of our patrons who've been supporting us through Patreon. Because of their generosity, we've now been able to take the Pure Faith app that we created years ago that's been for sale on the iTunes store, and we decided to just make it for free. And so thanks to everybody who became a patron last week, that Pure Faith app is now free for absolutely everybody. And so we'll put a link to it in the show notes here at the podcast. You can download that app and enjoy that for free. Another prayer app I want to highly recommend is Hallow. Now, Hallow is a sponsor of the Lust is Boring podcast. And so they're offering a free membership to use their prayer app, which is much more robust than our own. Happens Hallow to be the number one Catholic prayer app, number one Catholic app in the Apple iTunes store now. So check this thing out. In the link in the show notes, you just go to hallow.com/lustisboring. You can try that thing out for free for several weeks. And, you know, with everything going on in our country right now, I think what we need more than anything is just faith and hope in God. And remember, he's the king of all of our hearts, our nation, and the world. And I think nothing is going to do that quite as much as prayer, solidify that place in our hearts to make sure that he's the king and the prince of peace and all of us. So make sure to check out the Hallow app, because your patronage of our sponsors helps to keep this entire podcast going. So check it out. It's free. Download that thing. You're going to enjoy it. And then also coming out from the ministry, Matt Fradd and I are just about to launch the Forged book that we've been working on for many, many months. It's at the printer now. It's getting shipped in about a week and a half. And this is something we've been approached for years from guys. I'm like, man, I'm really struggling with this, lust and that, whether it's porn or messing up with my girlfriend or lust even in my own marriage with other women. Like, how do I break free from this stuff? And we've always given them this resource and that resource, but we've always been, I just wish I had one thing to give a guy and say, here it is, here's what you got to do. And so because we couldn't find it, we created it. And so it's a 33-day journey for guys to break free from lust and to find real lasting freedom. And every day of the book, you're going to get a free video on your phone from myself, from Matt Fradd, from Mark Hart, from Chris Stefanik, Father Mike Schmitz, Father Jacques Philippe, and each person talking about chastity and living out that from a different perspective. We got Sister Miriam James, Mother Miriam of the Lamb of God. One of the videos we have has 38 single young women saying how awesome it is that these guys are fighting to defend love from lust. And so Forged, you can get it through the link in the show notes. Pre-order now, and you get one free if you order another one, because we're only going to sell them in pairs because we want fathers to do this with their teenage sons. We want college roommate guys to do it together. High school youth ministry, youth group guys, do this thing together, because brotherhood is an essential component of living out this virtue. And so all that stuff is going to be on the show notes today. But today, hot topic of gender. We've covered it before on the show, and we've gone in depth in different angles. But you know, I think a lot of times we hit the intellectual aspect of this, which is super important. But sometimes what's missing is the pastoral aspect. And one of the reasons I decided to have our guest on the show today is because he's had a lot of experience in both worlds, not only in the intellectual, but in the personal, of actually talking to people who experience gender dysphoria, walking with them in their walk with Christ, in their path to holiness, and how the church can assist them in finding the joy that God created them for. And so today what I want to do is welcome onto the program. Let me click the link here and get Father on the screen with us. So Father Malachy, welcome to Lust is Boring. Thank you for joining us today from New York.
Great to be here with you, Jason. Thanks for having me.
And now I have to confess, you mentioned to me before we got on here that today is actually the feast of Saint Malachy, and I have to profess my complete and utter ignorance as to who that guy is. And so, could you give us a little primer on who Saint Malachy is as we get started?
Yeah, so Saint Malachy is an Irish bishop from the 11th century. He was best buds with Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. A lot more people would know him, but he was one who was called out of a life in studies of law to begin to dedicate himself to silence and prayer and monasticism, which eventually led to the leaders in the church in the area asking him to step up in the role as a bishop. And interestingly, just kind of a one thing that moves me always about him is he went to a diocese and a place in the life in the church in Ireland at the time where he described it as they are Christian in name only, but not in heart. And he said that I realized that I had two choices: to turn and to flee back to the monastery, or to stand and fight. And one of the things I love about him is he made a choice to stand and fight, and brought about a tremendous renewal in the life of the church in Ireland at that point in the history of the church. And that kind of courage and boldness in the response, even when it looks as if the situation is difficult, I believe is what the church needs a lot of today.
Yeah. No time to flee, for such a time as this. God gave us our
Amen.
own father. We got a new Father Malachy now, so you're in charge of this culture. So got your work cut out for you. And I love the work that you guys are doing with the C.F.Rs. I'm actually good friends with many of the men there. Father Pio and I went to college together. Father Joseph Mary and I went skydiving together in college. So got some good memories of the fellows. What a good bunch of men that you guys have as brothers there. And I know that you've really dove into this whole research of gender dysphoria, transgenderism, not only intellectually but pastorally as well. Could you kind of share with us, what got you interested in this subject, and what have some of your personal experiences been, with individuals wrestling with this?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing is I actually joined the Friars 12 years ago. And I can remember early on serving in our soup kitchens and homeless shelters in the South Bronx and Harlem, coming in contact with, young, adultish, middle-aged African-American men who were living as women. And in that experience, a kid from Georgia has never seen anything like it. It was sort of a bit like jarring. And yet, the more I spent time with them, the more I realized, like, these are real people with hearts that are longing for the same thing that I'm longing for, and maybe confused, maybe lost, maybe wounded, but still a heart like mine, a human heart. And that heart ultimately always is going to find its fulfillment in the heart of Jesus Christ. And so that was the beginning. But then later I started seminary, and I dove in intellectually, and you're doing philosophy, theology. And I've always had a love for St. John Paul the Great, and I developed a love for St. Edith Stein as philosophers. So I studied their anthropology. I studied about, their understanding of man and woman. And then towards the end of my seminary, I was getting ready to prepare for a thesis, and I had a conversation in a hallway with a professor where I was just lamenting the fact that I felt like, this like tidal wave of gender ideology was crashing on the church and the culture, and it seemed like nobody was saying anything. No one was doing anything. Or if someone was saying something, what they were saying was more or less like, well, the church is going to change, you're just fine as you are. Maybe compassion, but an absence of a real willingness to speak a hard truth. And so I was saying this, and he just looks at me. He's like, well, why don't you say something? And I'm like, okay, fine. And, he's like, why don't you write a thesis about this? And it just hit me in my heart. And I knew at that moment it was a grace to just see this was a path God was asking me to walk on, not one I anticipated. So the studies began, and I spent a year in depth, reading everything under the sun, and really trying to do my best to read on both sides, meaning I wanted to understand as clearly and as fully as I could the argument for those that are advocating for this understanding of gender that's coming out of gender ideology. And then I wanted to ask the question, how can the church respond? And so that journey of the intellectual led to these avenues opening up in Nicaragua, spending time talking about it, sharing with people down there on a summer assignment. And that opened up all of a sudden after talks, people coming up and saying, can I meet with you? And then I'm sitting in front of people with real experiences, and I'm like, I don't know what to say. I'm like, I can give you really good book definitions, but I don't know what to say to your situation. I don't know how to fix the suffering that's in your heart. And it was a really uncomfortable moment. And in that moment, there was this grace that came, which was like, you can't. I can't fix them. I don't have actually the answers that maybe they're looking for, but I do know someone who does. And that person, Jesus Christ, has a heart for them that burns with love. And he's allowed my heart to share a little bit in that. And so I began talking to people. And I also, in the research for this thesis, was blessed to hear like the full in-depth life story of a number of different people who are living their faith, struggling to live their faith in different places on their journey, but also struggling with gender identity, dysphoria, or some kind of confusion. And again, as I was there listening to them, I found myself coming up against the edge of basically like my limitation, my poverty in knowing how to love them and how to speak a word of truth to them that would be a word of life. And so this struggle, though, of like hitting this point where it's just uncomfortable to be there. I'd rather move somewhere else. I'd rather not be in the midst of a place where I don't feel like I have all the answers and it's not so clear the pathway forward. And this is kind of the pastoral terrain, right? This is a place where the book answers are very necessary, but when you're sitting in front of a human being whose heart is broken and suffering and they're struggling, like that's not the word of life. There's a living word that's in the heart of Christ for each person. And so being able to hear and listen to this person in front of me and hear and listen to the Holy Spirit and seek to speak that word to them and watch how that gives birth to life, transforms, heals. And more people have come over time. I've been able to do, masses for folks that are experiencing gender identity dysphoria as a priest, been able to hear confessions, have been able to walk with some parents as well who have children who struggle with this. And all of these places, it's like I'm only going because the Lord seems to be sending me. I don't necessarily consider myself any kind of an expert, and I definitely don't have the answers. But again, like I know that their heart is like my heart. It's one that's longing for that encounter with the living God, and that I do know where to find.
Now, what's that moment like when you're coming with all this book knowledge and love for them? But you've got Edith Stein here, you've got John Paul II, this theology, this anthropology, all this stuff, and now you're sitting down with a guy who's fully convinced that he is a woman, and maybe he's not convinced that he has a broken heart and he's struggling. Maybe he's convinced hey, I really feel happy as I know how to be. And what is that conversation like? How do you mingle the theology into the pastoral care and the accompaniment? Any concrete examples, stories, conversations you've had, where you've seen the light bulb go on? Or is it more of just an incremental walking with these individuals instead of trying to jam into the first conversation as much theology in the body as you possibly can?
It's definitely heavy on the listening because, I think the first thing is that somebody doesn't want to be your project, and they don't want to be a problem to be fixed either. But they need to know that they're a person who is loved. And so listening is the first way of saying, I believe that your story and your experience is worth listening to with everything that I have, giving myself to you in this moment. And in that listening not just to what they're saying, and this is something that's, just growing in and praying for the gift to be more astute with, is listening to what, Lord, are you saying to this person? Father, who do you see? Who's in front of me right now that you see? And show me how to speak that to them. And so the light bulb moments, being able to speak to somebody and hear their story and then speak back to them from that story is like, hey, you shared this experience about how you were picked on a lot and you struggled with, this feeling of rejection from guys. And then all of a sudden you looked and you saw women who were not being picked on and were not being rejected for not being so quote unquote manly. And then all of a sudden a movement in your heart started to happen, thinking if I was like them, then this bad thing wouldn't happen anymore. And to be able to just say that to somebody, all of a sudden it's like, whoa, yeah, actually, I never thought about that. And then the work of the healing, it's turning the light on to self-awareness, but more than that, it's being able to listen for okay, Father, what do you want to say to them? And there's been times where I just find myself honestly speaking, and I'm aware it's the Holy Spirit, and I just go, and I'm like, I don't really have a full plan on what's coming out of my mouth, but I do know that my heart is moved by the goodness of this person, and I want to speak to them about that. And in that sharing about that, I've seen people's demeanor change. I've seen their lives begin to open up in a new way to the church. One instance of sitting with a girl and her just looking at me and being like, it is so good after so many years of talking to so many priests who have no clue what I'm going through, to be able to speak to somebody who understands.
Yeah. No,
And
go on.
no, I mean, for me, like I'm like, that's the first step. That's the first step in this journey of helping them walk into freedom.
Yeah, no, I love the approach because it's not so much you're trying to get them to understand where you're coming from. If anything, you're just trying to help them understand themselves on a deeper level. You know, just to get
Absolutely.
to really take a look in there. And I think it's one of the reasons so helpful to them is just how good of a listener you are. They're able to use you as a sounding board, and then stuff comes to the surface. I remember talking to a girl once, and she came up to me and she's like, Jason, I'm thinking of giving my virginity away to this guy. You know, and my first impulse was just like, okay, let me give her a litany of 10,000 reasons why she shouldn't. But for some reason, the Holy Spirit just told me, Jason, zip it and just ask her why. And I'm like, okay, why? And she said, I don't know. And I'm like, okay, you're not allowed to say, I don't know. Why do you want to give that gift for that boy? And she was quiet for a second. And she said, I want to feel wanted. And I said, that's a really good, honest answer. I said, do you think he wants you? And she said, oh, I know he wants me. And I said, no. Do you really think he wants you? And she said, no. I said, what do you think he really wants? She said, he just wants sex. I go, is that what you want? She's like, oh, no, I'm going to break up with him tomorrow. I'm going to send him a text message right now. I'm like, you go, girl. Like, I didn't tell her to do a thing. All I did was ask the right questions, and she owned it. And so I think that approach is so super helpful. And you know, for a lot of the people listening now, you know, a lot of people may be new to this whole gender issue. I know when I started researching it, it was a steep learning curve because to me it was like gender, sex, you know, boy, girl, like how complicated this is X, Y, X, X, you know, why is this so? But then I started looking into it and it's like, okay, there's intersex, non-binary, transmasculine, two-spirit, gender non-conforming, gender neutral, gender this. And I was like, whoa, like how am I, you know, and I think maybe it would help if you could give the listeners a bit of a history lesson on the word gender itself and the etymology of that, of just the evolution in a sense of the word gender, because it isn't, you know, where it used to be 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So maybe give us just a little, you know, Cliff Note version of like what the word means today versus historically what it's meant. Yeah.
So I guess I'll go historical and then we'll talk about what it means today. So looking back, you know, the word gender itself comes from a root that's like thousands of years old, gen, which you think about, you know, the different words, engender, generations, generate. These different words that are connected with it tell us about what the origin is. So the origin of the meaning is giving birth, procreation, and also family or tribe. So that's kind of the core of it. And for me, knowing that is really important because at the root of gender and what we now know or has been described as the binary system is not some plan to oppress women. And it's not some plan to somehow, you know, like forcibly get people into boxes. It is the response to a primordial, essential human experience, which is to share in the mystery of bringing new life into the world. And there's only two ways to do it. You're either a mother or you're a father. You're a woman or you're a man. So at the root of gender and this binary expression of it as male and female is this human experience. So the word over time, you know, we're going to do huge flash forwards, the Cliff Notes. It shows up in English, in Middle English in the 14th, 15th century. Mostly, like you said on that show before, grammar related. With the whole scientific revolution, it becomes more connected with biology, anatomy. But in the 20th century is really when the shift happens to get into what we would refer to as kind of a modern definition. Mid-20th century, there's a guy, Dr. John Money, who's studying hermaphrodites, is what they would have been referred to at the time. Now it would be referred to as intersex. And his research with children leads him to publish a document in which he defines gender as the social characteristics, behaviors, and expectations associated with being a male or a female. And he, in fact, says that that's not something that's locked in at birth, but it's fluid up to 2 years. So mid-20th century, here's a scientist who publishes this article, and he's saying, I've got this research, and this backs it up. So gender at that point moves from before what had been connected with being a man or a woman, the gender sex synonymous meaning, to become something in which it's separate from sex. Sex is biology, and gender is social construct. And this is something that is not just in his world of science, but becomes sort of this explosive force in the culture with both sexual revolution and what's called second wave feminism, which is basically the feminism that rises up in the 60s and the 70s. And they're really, really harping on this new definition of gender because it gives a language to try and express how they feel that they've been mistreated or boxed in by culture, these expectations of gender roles and stereotypes, etc. So 60s and 70s, gender becomes known for, again, something separate from sex that has to do with a social construct. Now, John Money also continues his work and comes up with a further differentiation. And he says there's something called gender identity and a gender role. So now all of a sudden you've got this thing out there in the culture, which is social norm that constructs gender. And then now I have gender identity, which is how I feel about those norms inside. And so my sense of being a woman or being a man is something subjective, it's interior, it's my feelings, it's my emotions. And so that continues into the late 20th century when all of a sudden this movement to begin to introduce a new idea and understanding of gender arises. It's known as gender ideology. It's something that grew up earlier than that, but really gets named this by the church in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s. And again, this is an attempt not to merely fight for equality and justice for men and women. It's actually an attempt to eradicate differences between men and women and to say that there's actually this fluid spectrum. You hear about that, the gender spectrum. You mentioned some crazy different sort of like, names and labels and things that are out there. And this is kind of coming out of this progression. So John Money is important because he gives a scientific basis for what the feminists will create in their sort of social movement. And then later on in sort of international policy, especially the UN and the like, in different governments, you're going to see it become law as well. And this movement has advanced to where we're at today, in which case now certain countries to not use a preferred pronoun is criminal, or in certain places to even, one country, the craziest law I've heard of, they were wanting to outlaw, I can't remember if it was Sweden, it was they wanted to outlaw men being able to have urinals because it was unequal. Yeah.
We'll just give the women them,
Yeah.
Are we
Yeah.
even? Yeah.
Anyhow, so I mean, just because you get stuck in the ideology, and what is ideology? It's my idea becomes more important than reality. And so anything that conflicts with the idea I have of what should be is going to be decimated. It's going to be changed through science and technology, through hormones, through surgery, through law and public policy. So that's a little bit of the history, kind of where we're at today, and the landscape that we're looking at when we hear this conversation about gender in sort of the public sphere.
And now, why do you think the people behind this, and by people behind this, I don't mean individuals who experience gender dysphoria and are wrestling with this, but rather the masterminds or people doing this ideological colonization, trying to shift even developing nations that don't hold these values and trying to impose this in the school systems to the children. Like, what's the end game? Like, why do they feel a need to redefine human nature? And the terms, like I identify as non-binary. It almost sounds just liberating. Like, I'm not going to be restricted by your arbitrary norms of who you say I have to be. I've burst those asunder, and I'm free from them. So it has this sense of freedom and liberation and a lack of constraints to be who you truly are. And like, what's the end game behind all this? Like, why the need to redefine human nature?
Well, I'm going to say two things. The first is this, is that, the human person and human nature, as it's made in the image and likeness of God, is imprinted with mystery. In the same way that we're made in the image and likeness of a God who, even though he's revealed himself, he's a mystery. There's things that are beyond our comprehension. The human person is exactly that same type of mystery, analogously, in the flesh. And so when we're in front of like the tension that we discover in this world where we're living after the fall, we're living in the midst of brokenness, and we're living with the tension of like, I can't fully control a mystery. And if I can't fully control a mystery and I don't trust that there's a God that does, then I need to do something to either what they would call, you sort of reduce it. So the reduction, tear it down from where it's at. It's not a mystery. You're just matter. You're just atoms. Or that your body has no meaning. So there's this inability to deal with mystery. The further we move away from God as a culture, the less we're able to understand the mystery of our humanity. And when you can't understand it, the only thing you can do is sort of decimate it, whitewash it, reduce it. And so that's this process that's going on of trying to say, well, there is no real meaning. There is no real man, woman. And in fact, there's all this injustice that exists because of all these differences. So let's get rid of the differences so we can have justice. Yeah. And that's the fruit of a world that doesn't know the mystery of a God who is three distinct persons who are absolutely one. Without the mystery of the Trinity, how could we understand how two distinct ways of being human, man and woman, could possibly be one, could be in harmony, in unity, and not in conflict and competition? So that's one thing. The other is, and this is Benedict XVI, guess what? The same problem in the garden is still going on today. And that's the problem of humanity saying, I'm not going to serve. I will not allow God to be God and myself to be a creature before him. Pope Benedict XVI said that we live in the age of the sin against God as the creator. And this is kind of part of the fruit of the negative side of the scientific revolution, of modernity, where we set out to conquer the material universe, to know it and measure it and figure out how it all functions. And science is amazing at telling you all of that information, but science cannot tell you how to explain the mystery of the scientist. And because of that, it's trying to reduce the scientist to just be like everything else. There's no meaning in the world. There's just function. There's ways of operating. And those are the laws, but there's no meaning. And what is a meaning? Meaning is connected with your destiny. And if we have no destiny and we have no meaning, well, then guess what? That leaves us in a position where we need to create it. So if there's no creator who lovingly made us in his image and likeness, I need to create myself. And a world that has idolized freedom looks at that sort of project of self-creation and self-fulfillment as the greatest act of my autonomy and my freedom. But we're impoverished because we think freedom is like, no one can tell me you can't do something, as opposed to freedom is my capacity to know what is truly good and choose that and live that in my life. So those two things of like fleeing from the mystery by reducing humanity is part of the reason why this machine is unfolding. And the other is just the hubris, the pride of humanity. I will not be a creature before the Creator. I'm going to be my own God. Sadly, the fallout is if you're raised in a situation where you're told that, you've got this great freedom, you don't have any meaning until you choose it. You don't have any identity until you choose it. It creates this anxiety in young people and this pressure and a sense of homelessness, and a sense of a lack of belonging, and a sense of a lack of purpose. And underneath the very different ways perhaps that it shows up, it's that same problem. It's being unhinged from the truth that we've been made in love by our good and gracious Father in order to stand in relationship to him. as his beloved children in Christ.
There's so much to dive into. There's so much good stuff. And it, makes me think of, the individuals that I've met who wrestle with gender dysphoria. Typically, there's a lot of anxiety going on in their life in general, and especially in adolescence. It is so rife with, it's just tumultuous. It's a roller coaster, hormonally, emotionally, socially, relationally, within the family. Everything is in such a period of flux. And if you have a culture telling you, well, you've got to figure out, which of this laundry list of genders you are. And they're watching the YouTube stuff and this and that and these different people. And they're, okay, well, what am I? Well, I did feel that. And sometimes I don't feel like I conform perfectly to this stereotype. And they're sent on this unnecessary quest. When right in front of them is their body, which is meaningful. And they're told, yeah, don't look at that. Don't be distracted by the body. You need to go deeper than that. You need to go find something within. And they get sent out on this quest that's overwhelming. So, what is male? What is female? I know if you were to walk into any gender studies program at a major secular university and, Father Malachy were to be sitting in the class and you were to even say the word masculinity, you could get martyred on the spot, for even saying the word. So if you were sitting in one of those university classes and this stuff came up, and the professor put you on the spot and said, okay, well, Mr. Smarty Pants, Father Malachy, well, what is masculinity? Like, what is femininity? Like, is it really anything? Or is it just this social invention that girls wear pink and boys wear blue? What is masculinity? What is femininity? Is it anything?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I hear that question, I think about as a kid in Georgia on 4th of July, we would have greased pig chases as kids. We try and catch a greased pig, put it into a little baby swimming pool, and whoever gets it in there wins. And it's like every time you grab it and get a hold of it, it's slipping out because it's covered in Crisco. And it seems like this question is like that for us, right? We press in to want to define more clearly and fully masculinity and femininity, and it always seems to be slipping beyond grasp. So one thing I do have to say is that I've spent a lot of time studying this. I spent a lot of time reading all kinds of things about it, having conversations, and there will always be a certain element, again, of mystery that's involved with this, that if we are unwilling to accept, then we won't be able to stand in front of this question very long. So that's one thing to sort of put it in context. But femininity and masculinity are fundamentally, JP2 talks about this in Theology of the Body, and he's going to say, right, that it's this two ways of being made flesh, two ways of being incarnate as a human person. So femininity and masculinity directly connected to how it is that we exist as human beings in our bodies. And so you're right, the body matters because it's the context for my experience of the world. And, Edith Stein was very astute. She said that we begin at very different beginning points as men and women, and by the nature of the body that we've been given. And that nature orients us in different ways. You could talk about the science behind it. You could get into like the brains, the different ways that they function. You had some funny examples last time talking about this subject of, kids who are not acting according to the gender neutral stereotype somebody's trying to generate. And why? Because it's in us. It's in our bodies. Little boys are, like at the age of 5 already 10 times more likely to use a kitchen utensil as a weapon than a girl. It's just, it's in us. It's in our body. It's in the flesh. So what is it telling us? What is the body telling us? If we want to get to the essence of what it means to be a man and means to be a woman, what's masculinity and femininity, what's the body telling us? It's telling us two things. How do I stand in relationship to other people? And how am I called to make a gift of myself? Because as a human being, we always exist in relationship. There's no such thing. It is an illusion to say that I'm autonomous. I come into the world with a mother and father, even if they're not good or even if I don't know them. And I'm part of a family of some sort of relationships, even if it's not the best one. And how I stand in that series and that nexus of relationships is either as a boy or as a girl. And it's conditioned by my body, the very way that, a little baby girl is going to be able to sense the unspoken communication in the face of parents more so than the boy. And those human experiences form you and condition the way that you live your life. And so this way of being a man in the body, as a son, as a brother, as a husband, as a father, is connected to the essence of what we say when we mean masculinity. How a girl, a woman stands in relationship to others as a daughter, as a sister, as a wife, as a mother, is part of what we mean when we say feminine. And when you look at those relationships and you look at the ones that are what JP2 is going to call kind of the most essential expression of the two, which is fatherhood and motherhood, then you begin to sort of look at, well, how does this body tell me what it's going to mean to be a man? All right, well, that physical strength that I have, this capacity that is in me to be able to sense danger. This is a really cool one. So once you hit puberty as a guy, you walk into a room and immediately, without thinking, you are already subconsciously categorizing the faces of everybody in the room and making a decision: danger or no danger, friend or foe. And that reality is connected to the fact that masculinity has to do with protecting life, protecting others. Masculinity also has to do with providing. Look at this relationship, right, between a husband and a wife, between a man and a woman. This fundamental mystery of bringing new life into the world. And how do they participate in that? And it's going to reveal what we mean when we say masculinity. So a father is somebody who gives himself away and has a detachment from the gift. He's somebody who is oriented outward with his gaze of love as one who's giving a gift. He's somebody who's looking outward towards the other. And in that outward look, it's doing two things. One is he's recognizing the one whom he is giving himself to in love. And two, he's looking to make sure there's nothing or no one around that could harm them. So this role to be a protector is written into that masculine identity. And so is the role to be a provider, because again, you have a situation where, trying to survive, and a mother is trying to keep this child alive, and that mother is completely, if you've ever seen a baby in a mother's arms, like she's lost in the face of that child. And to be able to lose herself in the face of that child and give herself fully, she has to know that her needs are being met and taken care of, which is where this idea that we hear about, a provider, a protector, a leader, when we're speaking about masculinity, that's where this is coming from a real human experience, not from a social imposed construct. Now, in all the things that I'm saying, none of what I'm saying is that, masculinity means, bench pressing, 250, wearing camouflage, or, being able to burp louder than the guy across from you at the bar stool, What I'm saying about that is about the relationships that you have with others and the way that you give yourself in love. And so the body is saying, I'm outwardly oriented. You look at it and it lets you know that the way a man gives himself in love to a woman is in this initiating way. And that's not demeaning her. It's his way of giving himself. There is no other way for him to make a gift. But a woman, femininity, is connected with receiving that gift, not passively, but actively saying yes. Because for a woman to receive this gift of love, if she's not saying yes, we got a word for that. It's called rape, and it's horrible. It's active receptivity. It's the choice to say yes to the gift that this man wants to make of himself to her in his body, and she receives him in her body. And when she says yes to the call to be a mother, she does not say yes to something that is detached and outside of her. She says yes to something that's intimate and within her. And so this understanding of the relationship between women and motherhood, maternity, nurturing, John Paul II is going to say that their call is not so much to protect life and provide for it, but to receive it and give it full attention in every circumstance. And this way of living in their body conditions them. So like a woman, by the fact that she every month is aware that she is possibly going to be a mother from the time of puberty onwards to menopause, that fact conditions her experience of the world. It allows her to see that there's this call within her very body to motherhood, to gift, to nurturing new life. And one who's actually carried that life in their womb for 9 months, that woman has an awareness of the value and the precious gift that a life is. And that woman, from that point on, is not going to be able to look at another human being the same either. Again, like our body is conditioned, they're the context, the way we experience life. And so femininity is the way of experiencing life and reality in a female body. And masculinity is the way of experiencing life and reality in a male body. And those differences condition us and direct us to acting in different ways. However, and this is a very important point, back to Edith Stein, we begin in these different places, but we do have freedom. And there are differences. I love the examples you gave last time, right? Of like, you know, like you don't have to be this like, you know, sort of beating your chest dude, you know, to be a guy. You know, talking about your own love for wine. I love wine. I actually make wine. And it's, you know, something that during seminary I found to be a very productive way of procrastinating on my studies. But you know, there's not as if there's this one way of being a man or a woman. And that's why it's difficult to try and like wrap up into this tight synopsis, femininity and masculinity. But the differences are concrete and real because the body is concrete and real. And you can't change that. There is no undoing the way that we experience the world, even if some point later in life you would attempt through hormones or surgery to do so.
It's beautiful. And I think, you know, approaching it from that element of mystery is so important. I remember reading Frank Sheed's book, Theology and Sanity, where he essentially says, you know, mystery is not something that we can't know anything about. It's just simply something we can't know everything about. And so when it comes to masculine and femininity, it's not about being stuck into a mold. It's not about how we ought to be. It's about who we are as male and female. And, you know, as a father of 8, I mean, I've seen this innumerable times in my children. Like I've noticed, like when I hold my little girls when they were real young, they would always turn inward toward me. Yet, whereas when I'd hold the boys, they always wanted to go out. Like they wanted to look, where are we going? What are we going to do? What are we going to light on fire? Like what's happening here? Like they'd always want to be getting sent out. And this language is even within the church that, in a sense, the church is a mother and she's gathering us into mass, but yet the priest as the father at the end says, now go forth. And he's preparing to send us forth into this world. And, you know, it just endlessly, the world is trying to confuse people of like, well, no, you got to fit into this mold. It's the world that wants to put us in a mold. I remember my daughter sitting with her once several years ago, and we were just talking about life in general. And she said, well, sometimes I just don't feel like that much of a girl. And I'm like, well, why? And she said, well, you know, we had an arm wrestling class, you know, contest in class. And I beat all of the boys in class, except for one because he was afraid to arm wrestle me. And so I just feel like, oh, I'm faster than the other girls. I'm stronger than the other girls. And I said, look, being weak and slow doesn't make you feminine. And I said, here, let me show you something. I pulled out my phone. I said, you know, the Olympics just happened. I want to let's look at Romanian synchronized swimmers. Now look at some Asian gymnasts. Now I want to look at a shot put thrower from Atlanta, Georgia. And now we're going to look, and we looked at all of these various, you know, female bodies and gifts. And I said, okay, now this lady who can throw a shot put 50 yards further than your dad, is she less of a woman because she doesn't look like the Romanian synchronized swimmer? Like, is weakness more feminine? Like, and we just kind of walked through and gently unpeeled these layers of like, you got to fit into this mold. You know, granted, there are substantial differences. You know, when I kids, a couple years ago, we got to be on America's Funniest Home Videos. The kids, we film all these videos, we set one in, we got picked, we got to go on the show. And when we watch these like funny video shows, you know, and there's people doing just remarkably stupid things. I always tell my kids, now I just want you to count on this little fail video, how many of these people doing stupid things are male versus female. Now let's press play. And it's like male, ding, 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 ding. Okay, well, there's a woman, but she's with her boyfriend, so that's half a point each. You know, like, okay, well, there's a girl. I mean, they're on their slumber parties doing handstands in their bed, knocking over the ceiling fan. But like 9 out of 10, it's just guys doing stupid stuff with their bodies, jumping off a roof with a skateboard or whatever. And this isn't culturally imposed on them. This is on a deep neurological basis, you know, of what's going on to make them take these risks. And it doesn't mean at the end of the day, like, you got to fit in this mold, because even in our call to motherhood and fatherhood, it's manifested in such incredibly diverse ways. Because you look at the worst sinners ever, they're like clones. I mean, look at all the drug cartel, you know, guys. I mean, you can't tell them apart. Look at all the, you know, terrorists for Al-Qaeda, clones. Now look at the communion of saints, the Therese of Lisieux and the de Montforts, and it's like, it's unbelievable how radiantly unique they are. And, you know, just one story before we move on exhibits this so well is Mother Teresa and her motherhood. I mean, she was often thought of as this little soft-spoken, sweet Albanian nun. Like, I mean, dude, she was a tough cookie. A friend of mine was a Swiss guard to St. John Paul II. And the Swiss guards, you know, aren't necessarily always the most spiritual bunch of guys. I mean, they're 20-something guys who want to, you know, get to dress up in their pajamas and defend the Pope. It'd be a fun job. And so sometimes if they get in trouble, breaking curfew or whatever, they'd have to do some service work. And so Mario got in a little bit of trouble again. And so he had to do service work for the Missionaries of Charity at their mother house there in Rome. And so it's a hot Italian summer day, and he's in the kitchen, and he's got to scrub all the pots and pans. And he's sitting there scrubbing this pot, and it's like days old, caked in just stuff he can't get out of this, and he is not having it. He is frustrated. He started cussing a little bit. He went to scrub it. The water flew out. It landed on his jeans and his Italian shoes. You know, he lets out a little curse word. And then someone next to him hands him, you know, a little washcloth to wipe off. You know, and he grabs it from this little person and wipes himself clean. He looks over. It's Mother Teresa of Calcutta. And she just takes one look at him, and she says, "Wow, you sure are a sissy." He didn't know what to say. Like, he's a 6-foot-tall Swiss guard, and he's like, ugh. Yeah. And she just kind of heads out, and he was just, and she gave him a little miraculous medal to hold on to, and so he took the miraculous medal, and he lost the thing. Now, like 6 months later, he sees Mother Teresa again. I forget where he was. I think it was at the Bronze Doors or whatever, and she was coming in to meet Pope John Paul II. And she walks up to him. This time he's not in his jeans and whatever. He's got the whole regalia on. And she walks up to him, and she kind of looks at him. And she pulls out of her sari another miraculous medal, not having seen him in 6 months. And she hands him the medal, and she says, "This time, don't lose it, sissy." And she walks on by. And it's like, what? Like, how did she know? How did she know I lost that thing? And 6 months ago, one conversation, but like in her maternal love, it didn't mean she was this little wallflower. Like, she would speak the truth as a good mom would. And so, you know, we've gone down a little bit rabbit hole, but like for people who are wrestling with this, with gender dysphoria, the church, frankly, just seems out of touch of just like this stick in the mud, telling me to conform, that's not really who I am. It seems almost insensitive to the needs of people experiencing gender identity dysphoria. I mean, how can this actually be good news to them? Like, how could this be good news that I thought I've discovered my identity and I'm finally expressing it with my pronouns and my dress and the restroom I use and how I choose to express myself, and yet the church wants to put me in this little mold? How could that possibly be good news? What would you say?
Well, the good news is what gives freedom to the human heart. And I'd say that even somebody who right now at this moment is living actively in a trans lifestyle, and can look you straight in the face and say, you know, this is great. It's going great. I've never been happier. I know that their heart is made to be in relationship with the Lord. And I know that heart is longing for him. And so the good news that we bring them is that, the home that you're looking for, the identity that you're trying to build and create has been already given to you from before the foundations of the world. There is this great line in Ephesians chapter 1 that says, "You were chosen." I think there's a real struggle. You talk about anxiety, depression, these horrible things that often accompany those who experience gender identity issues. Suicide's often spoken about. You mentioned that in the last show. There's real suffering. And one of the greatest sufferings, I think, is this absence of a knowledge of their true identity, their place of belonging that's in the heart of God the Father. And so speaking to them about that is already looking to the original wound in the place in their life where there's a need for freedom from the need to somehow have the anxiety that I must be this way in order to be happy, instead of being able to recognize that all I need is to be loved in order to be happy, and I'm already loved, and I've always been loved. When you talk about the boxes and the things, if it is really true of who this person is, then there's a place for it in the box that the church has that it calls male and female, man and woman. But if it's not true, and if it's somehow flowing out of a place of woundedness, then there's no one else that's going to tell you that you need healing. There's no one else who's going to be able to look you in the face and love you enough and say, you know what? Maybe you're not totally all right. Maybe none of us are. And there is hope and healing in the heart of Jesus. And in a world that's just saying, you're doing fine, this is great, this is wonderful, and then the fruit of that and the real lived experience is actually in the long run that it's not, that so many are going to go on and actually, even in spite of all of the efforts and transitioning and actually commit suicide, take their own lives. I can't help but have a doubt in my heart when somebody says that this is just perfect and beautiful and everything's going great, when I look at the numbers and the reality of what seems to be happening for a lot of them. So I think it's good news, because if I were to be sick and no one around me were to say that I was sick, and I met a doctor who loved me enough to finally tell me that truth and offer me the healing and remedy for the illness that is in me, that's good news. And it's good news as well because the church doesn't have a rigid box that maybe that person's running from. There's a big enough space. There's a big enough room in the Father's house for you, whoever you are, and whatever sort of makeup and experience of your masculinity or femininity you might have. And that's good news. And there is a place of belonging, of being chosen in Christ, that they're already known and loved as children of the Father. And so again, that good news, I think, speaks to that homelessness, that lack of identity, the anxiety, the fear, the depression, the real self-loathing and hatred that can exist, even towards one's own body. There's great news. I read this just in the scriptures the other day where it says that in the book of wisdom, God did not make anything which he hates or which he loathes. There's nothing that he has made that isn't good. That's good news. You don't have to hate your body. You don't have to hate yourself, because God makes nothing which is not good. And even if there's brokenness, it's part of my humanity, whether it's physical, through illness, whether it's emotional, psychological, through some mental health struggle, or whatever the case may be. Even in that place, the goodness of God is there. And the power of that love to make all things new is waiting to be revealed as soon as we open our hearts up and say yes to the coming of the King, yes to Christ entering into those places of struggle, of woundedness, of brokenness.
Now, bringing it home to the family, let's say you're a parent and your 8-year-old comes to you and wants to start wearing dresses, maybe wants to change his name to her. Or let's say you've got a 10-year-old who says, I heard from my teacher that I can get puberty blockers because I think that I more identify as this gender than that gender. Or you're A 16-year-old shows up and said, okay, I've been researching this a bit on Tumblr and elsewhere, and I want to begin receiving cross-sex hormone treatments and therapy. Or you've got, a kid who's 17, just getting ready to finish off high school and say, Mom, I've really been struggling with this for years. I haven't told you, but I want to have a top surgery. Or I want to have some type of gender reaffirmation, change surgery. And you're the mom and you're the dad. How do you respond to this? Obviously in love and in truth, but for a lot of parents, they don't know what to do. I remember meeting a dad once with his son, and the father said, well, you talk to my boy, and I'm like, yeah, sure, be happy. And he brought the boy over, we talked together, and after the conversation, the boy wanted a transition, and the boy moved on, and the father came and said, see, you know what? He said, I just want to let the kid go through with it and have the sex operation, so that way when he's a little older and he regrets it, well, then that can be his punishment. And I'm like, oh, and my heart just broke, because I thought, well, what if your son went to a doctor and said, I want to get my eye taken out. I want to have my hand, I want to have my hand removed. I want to have my ear sealed up permanently. Would you ever be okay with that as a father? But because we're immersed in this hypersexualized culture, it's like every other body part is off limits except for the reproductive ones. And those we can just mold and manipulate at wish. So if you're the parent, how do you respond to this in a way that's not going to send that kid running back to his public school teacher and crying wolf and see, my parents hate me and they won't let me transition and I should be taken away from them and be given to parents who truly love me and are going to be willing to let me be who I truly am? What do you do with that volatile situation? Because I know in some countries they're willing to literally take you away from your parents if they don't run along hook, line, and sinker with the gender theory movement.
Yeah, it is frightening and it is scary for parents. I had a mother that reached out to me maybe 6 months ago and was asking me a similar situation like what you just described. Please talk to my son, and he's actually 17. He's wanting to, transition, all these sort of things, and I don't know what to do about it. And she was wanting to help, and she took him to this clinic, and went there, and she thought she was going to see this guy who was going to help, her son figure out his situation and deal with whatever was going on interiorly to be able to resolve the issue, to try and address his difficulty with his identity. And the kid comes out with information from the counselor who informed him that there's groups that will pay for your hormones, and there's groups that will pay for surgeries, and there's all these advocacy, and essentially gave him all the tools to walk out and without his mother's approval, against her wishes, to follow through with transitioning hormonally, surgically, etc. So I get this call. She comes and she says that for 2.5, 3 weeks after this meeting, she went back home, and the clinic, which this is against HIPAA, it's against a lot of it, called her and harassed her every other day, saying, you must bring him back. We're going to make sure that he, this abuse of a parent's proper role in relationship to their children that's happening is really, it's wrong, it's evil, it's unjust. So I would say one thing is, don't go walking into a gender clinic with your child. Do some research to find out where you can get the kind of help that's actually going to be help, and not just something that's going to enable someone to continue to walk down this path that, as you said, later, the regret and the irreversibility of that regret, because even if you start hormones and you do it for a temporary period of time, somebody said, well, you can always, stop taking the puberty blockers at any point. It was you can never get those years back for your body that you were on those hormones or on those blockers. What it does to you is not something that you can somehow all of a sudden just bam, back to normal. It doesn't work that way. So I would say move slowly is one thing. Look for the right kind of help is another, to be able to find counselors, find people who are willing to minister and walk with folks who are in that situation and get them real help. And then, it's stay in relationship no matter what. I remember I was at this conference, a mother of a boy who has same-sex attraction, who got married as a young man, you know, civil marriage to his partner, and his mom sharing the story said, you know, I told him we're not going to be able to go to that, you know, that ceremony, and he's like, fine, then I don't want you in my life, and she was like, I still love you, and she kept writing letters to him. He didn't respond, called him on his birthday, and over a number of like 3 to 4 years of just continuing to do what she could to keep the relationship alive, he opened up again and called back and said, you know, hey, you know, I'm going to be traveling for business and I'm in the area. Could we meet up? And something she said struck me. She said that relationship is the only context for conversion. Conversion can't happen outside of a relationship. Healing doesn't happen outside of a relationship. So staying in that relationship is essential. Listening, I mean, what I was talking about before, if it's a young child, see, they're different. If you're a little child, listen first. Where'd you hear this from? When did you first think about this? Where is this coming from? Listen to their story and try and find out. Now, this isn't always the case, but there are times, and more in this day and age, where it's, you know, somebody going and, you know, showing up at class or somewhere else and someone putting this idea in them. Another story of kind of where things are at, the ideology. Psychologist who is touting this great story of a young child coming in, and this child who's a little bit of a tomboy, this girl, mom's just wanting to have her talk through, you know, just kind of not getting along with the girls as much at school, etc. And this counselor listens to this child and then, you know, asks the child, you know, well, do you think maybe you're, you know, the situation is actually that you're a boy, you know, who's just got the wrong body? Like to like an 8-year-old, right? You're like, okay, well, and the response is, no, I'm a girl. And then the counselor says, well, let me ask you something else. You know, there's Pop-Tarts, strawberry and blueberry. They come, you know, in different wrappers, you know. It's like, what would happen if you got a blueberry Pop-Tart and a strawberry wrapper and you opened it up and it was blueberry inside, but it was a strawberry wrapper? Would you say that that's a blueberry or a strawberry Pop-Tart? And she gets this girl to eventually change and say, oh, maybe I am a boy in a girl's body. And then turns to her mom, you know, and says, Mom, I'm a boy. And it's like, and the counselor is like rejoicing and saying, we're giving them the language to be able to express, you know, what they're going through. And it's like, no, so to be aware that that's out there for parents is really important. To also know that, you know, I mean, you mentioned it before, but to say it again, for children who are pre-puberty, prepubescent, 80 to 92% of those children passing through puberty naturally will arrive at a recognition of their own sexual identity as it corresponds to their body. So ride the wave. It might be challenging, but, you know, all of us, man, growing up's tough. Yeah. And there's moments of confusion for everybody. And that goes for, you know, sexual attraction, identity. So listen to them, walk with them. Don't just smash them. The worst thing you can do is say, you know, well, you're just a boy, you know, or you, like a really strong, authoritarian, rigid response is the worst thing you could do. I know that from the stories that I've heard firsthand, that's one of the like key like flags I've seen in a number of people's stories. They're struggling a little bit. They go to a parent and they get a really strong, rigid response. And guess what happens? They fly the other direction. So that's not the way forward. So listening to them, loving them, staying in relationship, finding the right help, and being aware that there are people out there who are looking to make your child a part of their ideological project, and don't let them. Yeah. So
It reminds me of like people that I've spoken to that have wondered, okay, how do I tell my parents that I've been addicted to porn, or how do I tell my, parents I lost my virginity or whatever, and they're scared to death. I mean, they want to have this authentic relationship, but in the same respect, they're scared to death that once this conversation happens, it's just going to blow sky high. And one of the things I try to tell the parents is like, as this information is being disclosed to you, the temptation might be to go with your emotions and just go bonkers on the kid or whatever. But like, you can't allow your face to betray what's going on interiorly. Meaning, okay, inside, feel whatever you want, but make sure at the end of that conversation, your kid feels love. My mom didn't freak out on me. My mom didn't disown me. They didn't kick me to the curb. Whether it's pornography, premarital sex, gender, homosexuality, whatever the case may be, just try to keep your cool. Like if your 8-year-old says, Mom, I found porn on the internet. It's like, what? You looked at what? I mean, that type of volcanic reaction can send that kid into isolation and shame. It's like, heck, that's the last time I share that kind of information with that person. And so just try to keep your cool. Even if inside you're just bewildered and frustrated and angry at the culture, hey, try to keep your cool and make the kid feel that when he walked away, it's like, my mom still loves me. My dad still loves me. That they know that this is going to be a long game. It's not going to be one conversation. But I think parents, too, can start early and often of affirming the gender of their kids, that your body is not just wrapping on a candy. The body reveals who you are. And, you could pray with the kids at night. Oh, thank you, Jesus, for making Joseph a boy. Help him to grow strong, to be a man like daddy. And thank you for making Angelica a girl. And one day she'd be like mommy. And so that we're in their gender, because they're going to grow up with all kinds of different interests that aren't going to fit into every little cultural gender stereotype box. I mean, last week, I was working in my office, and one of my boys runs to the office like, Dad, rattlesnake in the backyard. I'm like, okay, let's go get him, guys. So all the kids are going bonkers. So there's 2 dogs outside. We've got a gigantic African Mastiff dog who the kids named Megalodog after the Megalodon movie. So we've got Megalodog, and then we've got Meatball, who's our English Bulldog puppy, and they're going bonkers, and the kids are trying to drag them inside. We finally get the dogs, and I'm like, okay, guys, we got this. Here's how we're going to take care of this. My boy's like, can I get my gun? I'm like, okay, go ahead, get your gun. I got the shovel. And so the rattlesnake's coiled up underneath the slide in the backyard. And they're like, what do we do? I'm like, okay, now Colby, you get down like a sniper, and you're going to take some shots at it. And then it's going to slither out the back of the slide. I'm going to be on top of the swing set, and then I'll drop the shovel, cut its head off, and then, then they're going to be done with this. And so he's like, all right, and he's, shooting that thing, and the kids are cheering, and, I get the head cut off. And then, so we've got it dead now. And so my daughter, of all people, is like, let's dissect it. And I'm like, what? She's like, yeah, let's dissect it. I'm like, all right, go for it. So we bring the rattlesnake inside. Kristalina's obviously not enjoying this as much as we are. But I show her how to clean the rattlesnake, and she didn't even want gloves. I mean, she's like a 13-year-old girl, and she's gutting this rattlesnake on the kitchen table on some little plastic tray, and everybody's gathered around it, and then they want to put the head in a Ziploc and the rattler in a Ziploc and all this. And after a day of it, my wife's like, okay, enough. We're throwing away all the body parts. And then just like yesterday, my wife's in the kitchen. She's like, what is that awful smell? I've smelled it for like a week now. Turns out one of the kids took like the gelatinous corpse of this rattlesnake and stuffed it into the back of a kitchen cabinet and mom's like, who did this? Which one of you did this? And it's my 8-year-old daughter. And she's like, I wanted to keep it because you were throwing away all the other parts. And so I just kind of chucked it in the back of the cabinet. But like my 13-year-old daughter dissecting it barehanded, 8-year-old daughter keeping body parts in a Ziploc bag. Meanwhile, my 14-year-old boy is like, I don't want to even touch that thing. I just want to shoot it. And so the beauty of God's plan for human sexuality as male and female, it's not about being put into a box. These are fully masculine, fully feminine responses in their own beauty. And so, so as parents, again, just kind of take a deep breath. It's going to be a long journey here. We don't need to get the first conversation perfect, but just make them feel love. Now, switching gears, if you're in college and let's say you're in freshman orientation and they're going around the room and the freshman orientation leader's like, okay, I'd like you to say your name and where you're from and what your preferred pronoun is. And you're some Catholic kid from high school in the Midwest, and now you're thrown into this secular state university, and some people are calling themselves they and Z and this and that, and it's coming around the circle to you. And then maybe in some small group afterwards, some person says, oh yeah, my preferred pronoun is they or Z. How do you respond to this person like, okay, well, if that's what you want me to call you, I'll call you, or like, nope, there's no way on earth I'm you. What is the proper Catholic response in terms of people who want you to refer to them by a preferred pronoun that doesn't reflect the reality of who God created them to be? It's a toughie, but how would you recommend people respond?
Well, people are wanting respect and they're wanting justice. And both of those things are connected to truth. And so there has to be in any relationship mutual respect. So the way that I was actually talking to a college girl who was in this situation, and she's like, what do I do? I've got this person who I've been friends with, and all of a sudden they come in and they're like, I'm they now. And you're like, they now? What are you talking about? Who are you hanging out with? It's like, and she's like trying to figure out, what do I do? How do I respond? And I said, well, the question is, one, like, what's the nature of the relationship? You need to determine that. Is this an acquaintance, or is this a friend? Is this somebody I've meeting for the first time? Is this somebody I've known for a while? Because it changes how we interact with them. But there's definitely need for mutual respect. And that means I can look at somebody who I know and I can say, respect you. And I want to be in relationship with you. And I know there's certain things you have convictions about and that you believe. And, and I do reverence that freedom that you have to hold those beliefs. And so I'm not going to ask you to do anything that would contradict them or act against that. But I'm also would ask the same of you for me. There's certain things that I believe and I have a real firm conviction about and I can't do. And, and I hope that you have the ability to respect me enough to accept that and to accept me as I am. So in other words, use the same language and put into their court, because what now is the situation is it's like the onus is on you to kind of conform to this expectation. Well, then all of a sudden you're like, okay, well, I'm okay with respecting you, but I need you to do the same for me if we're going to be in a relationship. And part of that is I am not going to be able to say something that doesn't correspond to reality. Names get a little bit tricky, and I have to be honest about that. But pronouns are actually words that have definitions that correspond to objective reality. And so to use a pronoun that is contradictory to reality is to speak untruth. And if I love you, I can't do that. I might not be obliged to always speak the fullness of truth, because there's sometimes I need to bite my tongue, but I am always obliged when I do speak to speak the truth and to use something like they, which is a pronoun that refers to a plural group of persons. To use that for a singular individual is contradictory to reality. And then to begin to try to create new words and new pronouns and things of that sort, what I do have reverence for is that people are struggling with the fact that there's boxes that I feel like I don't fit into and I don't know where I fit. There's kind of expectations that I sense of being put on me about what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman, and it doesn't really correspond to my interior experience. So how do I respond to that? What do I do with that? Now, I think it's good to not throw it in people's face. And here's a little tip to kind of, let you know that if I'm talking to somebody about you, Jason, and I'm telling them, hey, like Jason and I were on a show the other day and we had a great conversation. Jason was telling me about his family, and one day Jason was out with his kids in the backyard and they killed this rattlesnake and it was really amazing. Man, Jason's just an amazing guy. And in that entire phrase, I just avoided using pronouns intentionally. And I used your name. So you can do that. You can just, if it's a kind of thing, and I have to say, there's sometimes, because I don't want to throw it in people's face, because I have heard, and this I think is true, people's experience, as far as I can tell, when people are really intensely struggling with gender identity dysphoria, it's not some kind of like constant situation where they're always feeling this tension and anxiety. There's actually moments, situations that provoke it, something akin to like PTSD or something, right? So there's like triggers, right? And so for some people, where they're at on their journey of healing, saying, she for this guy is a trigger that's going to cause him a lot of anxiety, and like, interiorly, it's going to really stir up that experience of dysphoria. And I don't want to do that. So I'm going to try my best to avoid doing that. And so I'm not going to intentionally throw it in your face. I don't think that's the way that the Lord would respond personally. And beyond that, I think, again, you're not always obligated to speak, but if you speak, you're always obligated to speak the truth. So if something contradicts the truth, you cannot say that and it be an act of love, period.
I like the approach you're taking of putting it, in a sense, back into their court. That, let's see how truly inclusive your inclusivity is. Because all too often, the cultural idea of inclusivity is nothing but exclusivity. Whereas it's like, okay, if we're going to really celebrate diversity here and have mutual respect, we've got to be able to say, hey, look, we don't have to agree on everything under the sun, and we can still treat each other with respect. And I mean, you saw that the Supreme Court with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Scalia. I mean, you couldn't have two more polar opposites, but then after debating and arguing all day long, they'd go have a beer together. And it's like, okay, that's grown up. That's where we need to get, where we don't have to see eye to eye on everything, but we can still treat each other in a human and civil manner. And so, in wrapping up, with all your research of John Paul II, theology of the body, is, he spoke of this rupture, this fracture, so to speak, between the body and the soul. That with original sin, not only was there a rupture between humanity and God and between man and woman, but even within the human person himself, between body and soul, and this manifests itself in different ways for all of us. So it's not just the church picking on trans people, like, oh, you're the ones with this issue. It's like, this is a part of the universal human condition. And so in what ways would you say that this manifests itself in other ways than transgenderism in all of our different lives, so that those who experience it in this area realize you're not alone. You're not this little corner of the church over here that needs, all this, to be fixed. It's like all of us are experiencing some brokenness between our body and a spirit in a different way. And just so we can make this more Catholic universal, what are some other ways that you've seen that this afflicts all of us?
Well, I think you're right on, and this is something that I've been intentionally trying to speak to over, the last couple of years of studying this, is that people who experience gender identity dysphoria are not particularly screwed up, meaning that they're not somehow especially broken, worse off and more so than everybody else out there, and they're this big problem to be fixed. In fact, as I was studying theology of the body and you're reading about all this stuff, the body and the person and manifesting the person, I realized, well, all right, you're saying this, but then I'm hearing this experience, and how can I give an account for this experience of this person who struggles with recognizing their body as their own? And so this language of rupture was one of the things that was there. But as I read it, I began to see it's like, well, the rupture is the loss of a recognition of the meaning of the body. So I begin to lose a sense of the essence of what the body means. It means that it's the manifestation of the person, and also that spousal meaning you've spoken about a lot in different settings of the body that's called a communion. And after the fall, when that rupture happens, well, guess what? The body is no longer just something that's going to reveal a person and be a call to communion. It's now an object to be used. I mean, you talked about that book Forge earlier. Pornography. JP2's great words. Porn is not something where people see too much. It's where they see too little, because they do not see the person. So what happens is the body ceases to be the sign it's meant to. So the rupture, I'm not seeing the person, I'm just seeing the body as an object. And that can happen in a lot of different ways. When my body becomes an object, it becomes an instrument, well, then I can use it for all kinds of things. In the world today, the whole rise of surrogate pregnancies, is a case in point where the body is now just this object. I can sell my womb to be used. Lust, inside marriage, outside marriage, whatever the context is always a rupture. And what is it? I'm actually not just failing to see your body as something that reveals and is a person, but I'm failing to see that my body is actually me, has a dignity in itself, reveals the person of who I am. So the rupture is it's gonna lead me to use others as an object for my own pleasure through lust. It's gonna lead somebody who's in the business world and economics to see the bodies of the people who work for them as instruments, like a machine, to gain them more money. And so they're going to treat them like a machine because it functions and does this thing and produces this end. Our bodies also get treated, as like objects. The rupture that happens when I choose to live a life that's grossly unhealthy because the pleasure that's coming from my tongue and the feeling of my belly being full is more meaningful to me than the dignity of the integrity and health of my body. So the fundamental rupture is the body loses its personal value and its significance. And so therefore it begins to be used as an object. And anywhere that this happens, I could do it to myself too. Drug abuse is a prime case of this as well. Like when my body is being used, or even abuse of anything, abuse of alcohol, drunkenness, I'm abusing my body. I'm using this as a way to get pleasure that doesn't reverence and respect the dignity of my person. And this abuse that's happening against the body is always reflective of the rupture that I failed to recognize who I truly am and who this other person is in and through their body. In the case of, sexuality, it's also the loss of the meaning of the body with man and woman, that there is this complementarity, a call to communion, a love that reflects a Trinity. And so we say, well, no, there's no value in it. There's no meaning in it. So I can use my body for whatever sexual act with whomever I would like to do any sexual act with, which opens up the whole arena of same-sex relationships and homosexuality. And then with gender identity, you could say that there's something particularly acute because it's such a deeply experienced rupture that I don't even recognize. Not only does my body become an object, but it's almost like a disappropriation. It's not mine. And that rejection of it is something that happens interiorly. But it's a fruit and goes back to that original rupture, which is a rupture between humanity and God that happens in the garden. Because once I lose my, reference point, my guiding star that lets me know where I'm meant to go and what my destiny is, then all of this becomes confusing and muddled and misdirected.
Father Malachy, I can't thank you enough for being with us today. For our listeners or viewers, where should they go to dive deeper? If they want some books, whether it be on anthropology, whether it be pastoral stuff for parents, where do I find a right counselor? Or, hey, I'm experiencing this myself. Where do I look at? Are there any resources out there that you would recommend for someone to look into, whether it be just purely for research purposes, pastoral needs, or individual guidance? What's out there on this subject within the church?
I think within the church, the groups that I know of that are doing good things with this, Courage Ministry for sure is a place that has a good resource. Their website has a lot of different, from the research into things, but also pastoral counseling is available through them. There's another group, Eden Invitation, that I've been in relationship with. It's a good place if you're someone young person experiencing struggles, either with same-sex attraction or gender identity dysphoria, to go for, again, some pastoral assistance and ministry. Book-wise, you mentioned, when Harry became Sally, I think it's on your website. There's, that you last time that resource page you came up with, chastity.com/gender, I think was really good. Checked it out. I appreciate what you did there. And also just so about 3 weeks or 4 weeks from now, Friars are gonna release a podcast that I did, 4-part series on this same subject. So there's gonna be more in there. So check out from the Friars, C.F.R's, 3 to 4 weeks out from now, we'll be releasing a 4-part podcast series that I did with Father Mark Mary, deep diving again on this issue, even more so than what we had the time to do today.
Oh, well, fantastic. And so I'm going to put as many of these links as we can in the show notes. As you had mentioned, the chastity.com/gender. It's a whole research page. Some of that's just peer-reviewed sociological journals on the topic. Some of it is more pastoral in nature. There's even links for like, hey, I'm a principal at a Catholic school, and we've got a guy who wants to be on the girls' track team. Like, okay, what do we do here? And it runs you through pastorally how to handle these challenging situations. All that is going to be through that link, as you had mentioned. The forged book that we're coming out with, you can still buy one, get one free at the link in the show notes, or just go to chastity.com. Likewise, the Pure Faith app I mentioned at the top of the show is free on the Apple Podcast Store or on the Apple iTunes Store. You can download that for free. And then the link again at the bottom for Hollow. You can try that for free for a dozen days as well. And if you want to support the program, we really appreciate it. You just go to patreon.com/Jason Evert, and a gift of any amount is huge in helping us to pay for all the costs behind the scenes to keep this podcast growing and taking care of our family as well. And so if you want to support us in that way, you can do so through Patreon. But Father, as we close, could you give us your blessing? Because I can bless my mashed potatoes and my kids and everything, but the blessing of a priest is out of this world, so I'll take it anytime I can get it for myself and all the viewers.
All right. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we are your beloved children. And so today, just lift up to you each of your children, those who know your love and those who wander lost in the darkness and have not yet met that love. And I pray for a grace for the church at this time, a grace of courage and holy boldness in bearing witness to the gospel, and a grace of sharing the tenderness of the heart of the Good Shepherd for those lost sheep who need to meet you, who need to meet the Father. I pray, Father, for your blessing through the prayers of Saint Malachy, of Saint John Paul the Great, Saint Martin de Porres, to come upon Jason, his family, on all the viewers, on the entire church, Lord, at this moment. And may Almighty God bless you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Well, God bless you, Father. Thanks for coming on again. And all listeners, viewers, be assured of our prayers. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. You can also subscribe to the podcast Lust is Boring on all the platforms as well. So God bless you, Father Malachy. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, God bless you too. Peace.